Protoevangelium of James, one of the early Christian writings that is not canonical. It's not in the New Testament, but it is given great authority because it's our only source of information on the parenthood of Mary, and also it gives us insight. It's one of the written witnesses to the development of the, in earliest Christianity, of the Marian dogmas. Do you know what the Marian dogmas are? There are 4 of them. Immaculate Conception of Mary in Anna's womb, yes. The Assumption. The virgin birth, so the Virgin Mother, or Mary the Mother of God, and Mary Queen of Heaven. Right. And so we will, when we finish this, and as we continue in our study of Mary, we will end up in the Catechism of the Catholic Church looking at the Marian dogmas. But you've covered the Old Testament references, the New Testament words, texts that include Mary and her words over there. And so this was the next document, and then we'll look at Marian history and Mary and the mystics and depictions of Mary, and Mary's messages when she appears to people. This is very, very interesting. So today we're in the middle of the Protoevangelium. Last time, just to recap, we picked up in paragraph 12, and Mary has received this special yarn with the purple, blue, and scarlet to be spun so that it can be woven into the special curtains of the sanctuary of the Holy of Holies in the temple. And she spins the purple and the scarlet, and she takes it to the priest, and she got yet another blessing. In this document, Mary is blessed by the priest many, many times. And then Mary visits Elizabeth, and Mary answers, Elizabeth asks, "Whence is it to me that the mother of my Lord should come to me?" In this version. But Mary, and it also says that Mary had forgotten the mysteries which the archangel Gabriel had spoken. She says, "Who am I, Lord, that all generations should bless me?" And we talked about that, how in this version, the non-canonical version, that mostly follows the infancy narratives in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, how could it say that she had forgotten it? But that was the oral tradition that came down to the writer of this document. And then she stays 3 months and she grows bigger. And then Mary is afraid of the judgment of the sons of Israel, so she goes away to her own house and hides herself, and the Protoevangelium says that she was 16 years old. So there's more details that were being handed down than were included in the Gospels. And then in paragraph 13, Joseph returns from building his buildings. He sees that Mary's expecting a child. First he blamed himself, throws himself down on the ground, says what happened to Adam has happened to me, right? That the serpent got to Eve, right? And he questions Mary, and Mary weeps, and she says, "I'm innocent, I have known no man." And then he asks her again, "Whence is it that what is in your womb?" And she says, as my Lord liveth." That's an oath, taking the name of Yahweh, right? "As my Lord liveth, I do not know," which is a departure from Luke's gospel because the angel tells her. And then in section 14 we read about Joseph's quandary. What is he to do if he conceals her sin? He believes she's sinned. So sad for me, this scene. "I violate the law, but if I expose her to the sons of Israel, I shall be found guilty of giving up innocent blood." In other words, she would have been stoned. And what is this? What if this is by an angel? He says. Now, she didn't tell him it was the message of an angel, but he thinks, what if it is? And then I would be guilty of shedding innocent blood. And then an angel appears to him in a dream at night, and the text says he keeps her. All along, it never mentions marriage. It just says he keeps her because that's what the high priest asked Joseph to do with Mary when she was too old to stay in the temple. And then in 15, the scribe Annas shows up at Joseph's house and says, how come you haven't come to the temple? And he observes Mary with child, and he goes back to the temple and he tells the priest, and he accuses Joseph of a stealth marriage without telling the sons of Israel, and officers of the temple are sent. Officers were in the temple that were under the orders of the priests, and they are sent to arrest Jesus in the garden. And Mary and Joseph are brought back, and Mary is questioned, and she says, I am pure before him, meaning the Lord, that I know, and I know not a man. And they question Joseph, and he says, I am pure concerning her. And the priest accuses Joseph and Mary of false witness. And then in chapter 16, we had this fascinating passage where, in order to test the veracity of their statements, they are made to drink the water of the ordeal. And in our Bibles, we looked that process up in Numbers chapter 5, 12 and following. And it was a long process, and you have to drink a certain kind of water, and then if you're guilty, physical ailments come to you, and if you're innocent, you remain unhurt by the power of God. And it involves some of the dust from the Holy of Holies. And it involves ink from the accusations with water run across the page. Amazing little glimpse of Old Testament ways of trying to find out the guilt or innocence of a person. They submit, they're sent out to the hill country, they come back and they're unhurt. And and the priest exonerates them both, and he takes Mary back to his home, rejoicing and glorifying the God of Israel. And we had quite a wonderful discussion about why it was that both Mary and Joseph got separate visions of an angel with the Annunciation of this pregnancy, and why it was they didn't reveal it. And that was fascinating. We had several theories. So we pick up today. One was that if they weren't believed, it would be considered blasphemy for them to say this. Much like later when Jesus reveals himself, and he's, or indirectly calls himself the Son of God and claims to forgive sins, he is accused of blasphemy. So we pick up today in section 17. And before we start, are there any questions based on what we did? Did anything occur to you over the week? Okay, so we'll pick up in 17. Do we have a reader for section 17? Thank you, Kathleen.
There was an order from the Emperor Augustus that all in Bethlehem of Judea should be enrolled. And Joseph said, I shall enroll my sons, but what shall I do with this maiden? How shall I enroll her? As my wife? I am ashamed. As my daughter, then? But all the sons of Israel know that she is not my daughter. The day of the Lord shall itself bring it to a pass as the Lord will. And he saddled the ass and set her upon it, and his son led it, and Joseph followed. And when they had come within 3 miles, Joseph turned and saw her sorrowful, and he said to himself, Likely that which is in her distresses her. And again Joseph turned and saw her laughing, and he said to her, Mary, how is it that I see in thy face at one time laughter, at another sorrow? And Mary said to Joseph, Because I see 2 peoples with my eyes, the one weeping and lamenting, and the other rejoicing and exulting. And then they came into the middle of the road, and Mary said to him, Take me down from off the ass, for that which is in me presses to come forth. And he took her down from the ass, and said to her, Whither shall I lead thee, and cover thy disgrace? For the place is desert.
Thank you, Kathleen. So this is following Luke's gospel with the order from the emperor, right? Do you notice anything different, though, in here?
Joseph's son.
Yeah. Joseph's son is there, right? And in the next passage, we're going to find out that there are 2 sons, right? This fits in the in the early church, 2 different descriptions of how it was that Jesus had quote-unquote brothers. In the Eastern Church, the Greek-speaking church, it was that he was a widower with children. In the Western Church, that it was that the term brother in the Aramaic version of the scriptures, which would underlie the Greek Gospels, there was no word for cousin, so therefore it would use brothers. So this puts us solidly in the camp of those who believed that Joseph was a widower. The Gospels are silent on this. Okay, what else do you notice? Or is there anything curious?
He hasn't taken her for his wife yet.
No, and he hasn't so far in the whole thing, because when the priest chose him first, remember he reneged and said, no, I would be embarrassed before the sons of Israel. I'm an old man. What would they say about me? This is a young girl. And then the priest prevails upon him and it orders him to keep her, because she can't stay in the temple at the age of 12 because of defilement rules. So he agrees to keep her, and he continues to keep her. As we saw last week, right? He takes her back into his home and keeps her. Which reminds me of a beautiful Psalm 121, where Yahweh is my keeper. And it's a very short psalm, but the word keeper repeats, I think, 8 or 9 times. God as the keeper, right? And in Genesis, Adam and Eve are given dominion over the garden to till it and keep it. Keeping is a big word in Hebrew and in the Gospels too. This, as we said in the very beginning of our reading of the Protoevangelium, this writer has 3 sources. He knows the Old Testament very well. He knows the Gospels of Luke and Matthew very well. And he has some extraneous sources, and we already pointed to some of those. The whole idea that Anna made a sanctuary out of Mary's bedroom, and she could only eat certain things that were ritually pure. The whole emphasis on the purity, ritual purity as well, sexual purity, everything purity, the emphasis. What else is in here?
See, when Joseph turned and saw her sorrowful at one moment and then laughing at another, and then she talked about how she had, I guess, this vision, okay, of 2 people, one weeping and one lamenting, and I'm wondering if she didn't have a vision where she could see the death of her son, and then again the resurrection.
The writer seems to suggest that she sees something, that's a vision, right? So yes, I would agree. There's what we call intertextuality in Bible studies. If the more you read the Old Testament and then you read something like this or the New Testament, your ears ring a little bit, and you recognize something. She says, I see 2 people in my eyes. Who in the Old Testament, in the patriarchal period, talked about having 2 nations in my womb? Do you remember? Rebecca, wonderful, wonderful, that's great. She said that they were fighting with each other, Jacob and Esau, before they were born, right? And they do become the ancestors of 2 different nations. Esau of the Edomites, and Jacob, of course, of the whole nation of Israel. But in this case, she doesn't have twins in her womb. She has a vision, just like you said, Rick. I see 2 peoples with my eyes, one weeping and lamenting, the other rejoicing and exulting. Can you imagine, can you think of anything in the New Testament that we've just read, actually, in Luke, that would refer to that? 2 peoples. Remember when we read early on the passage in Luke, in the infancy narratives, in chapter 2, I think, yes, 34 and 35, I'll just quickly flip to it. It's Simeon talking, and Simeon gives a prophecy. And he says, This child is destined for the falling and rising of many in Israel. Those who fall will lament, those who rise will rejoice, and to be a sign that will be opposed, so that the inner thoughts of many will be revealed, and so forth. And in Mary's Magnificat, she says, also she talks about, he has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. He has brought down the powerful from their thrones. Here, those at the arrival of the Savior, those will lament. And lifted up the lowly, those will rejoice. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty, and so forth. Speaking about the mercy of God, Jesus comes in mercy. And the proud will fall and lament, and the poor and the humble will rejoice. Now, in that interpretation, I'm following Professor Michael Kloss from the University of Ottawa, his book on the Book of Mary that I ordered online and read. It's one of the few commentaries. There are almost no commentaries on this book. Yes. So she has that kind of a little vision. What about up in the fourth line where Joseph is trying to decide how to enroll, and when he takes her, and as my wife, I'm ashamed. As my daughter, all the sons of Israel know she's not my daughter. And then he ends up where? The day of the Lord shall itself bring it to pass, as the Lord will. What does that mean? That's quite an enigmatic statement. I've puzzled over it a while. Maybe you can help me out.
I just felt like he was giving it up.
Yeah.
Giving it up in what way?
To God.
To God,
Yeah,
yes.
that'll be what it.
Vicky says he is giving it up to God as he wills, right?
It's kind of like what Mary says in the scriptures, may it be done to me according to
thy
thy
will.
will. Yeah.
Let's just, I'm going forward in faith. Look where God's taken me so far. And it will, let it, what's the exact word? The day of the Lord shall itself bring it to pass as the Lord will. Okay, so I agree he's giving it up to the Lord and saying, let it be done according to your will. But why does he say the day of the Lord shall itself bring it to pass? Remember, the day of the Lord is so important to the humble of Yahweh who are awaiting the birth of the Savior. At the beginning of the Gospel of Luke and other Gospels, the faithful who come to Jesus by night are still waiting for the day of the Lord. The Essenes were waiting for the day of the Lord. The powerful and the mighty and the Roman collaborators weren't waiting for the day. It takes fear of the Lord, profound wonder at the power of God, to be thinking always of the day of the Lord. But it's why Jesus told us to be vigilant with so many parables. So he says, the day of the Lord will bring it to pass as the Lord wills. Wow. How, can you put those two things together? Giving it up to the Lord and the day of the Lord, which was going to be a finite day, which would take everyone by, like a thief in the night, by surprise. What do you think he's thinking?
That he'll be judged at that moment, and then,
The
then he'll figure out the...
He will know when the Lord reveals himself when he comes on earth, which is what the Old Testament prophets taught the day of the Lord was. There was so much iniquity and so much injustice that seemed to go unpunished by God that the hope was put forward into the future. When the Lord comes, all accounts will be settled. That's what all the prophets say, right? And especially the minor prophets that you know about, right? Baruch and Haggai and Zephaniah and Micah, there's so many of them, Malachi. They talk over and over, line by line, the day of the Lord is coming, right? When all things, and God will rule on earth and there will be no more injustice, right? And the people on earth at the time of the birth of Christ were waiting very impatiently for the God's coming. And sometimes the day of the Lord and the idea of the Messiah were conflated into one event. And so we could argue that Joseph is one of those who's saying, the Lord's coming any minute. I'm not gonna worry about this. It will all be revealed. What is the Lord up to? The day of the Lord will bring it to pass, and then I'll know. What do you think of that interpretation?
I like it.
Some of it though just seems like kind of what Vicky was saying, a little more immediate.
Mhm.
Like, well, I'm not quite sure, but it's going to happen. I'm going to trust in God.
And he's
It's
just going
right.
forward, and he doesn't
Yeah.
even have a plan.
Right.
Does that remind you of any of the dictums of Jesus in the New Testament? Do not worry.
Yeah, when he sends the disciples out and just take
Tomorrow-
one cloak.
Tomorrow will
and
take care of itself.
Don't worry
Exactly.
about the food, don't worry
Right,
about
and they'll
what
bring
it
you
is.
before princes and kings, and do not worry what you are to say, right? Same thing. A beautiful thing. Hard to do, right? So we have the two peoples in her eyes. Take me down from the ass, for that which is in me presses to come forth. And he takes her down. Whither shall I lead thee and cover thy disgrace? For the place is desert. Not meaning desert, but deserted. Nothing, no one there. Right. Any more thoughts before we pick up in section 18? And so
Just
here,
that he accepted this pregnancy and now, I didn't like that he called it a disgrace when it was
Ah.
actually time to give
Yeah.
birth.
That word
You know,
bothered you.
I have been unable to find either a Greek or a Latin text online, so I could show you, but this is a translation issue. Just like we saw before when it said that the undefiled daughters of Israel led her astray, and there I found in his translation that the Latin is divertere, and it means to entertain as well as to divert, right? Cover your disgrace means make you decent, not have you exposed, all right? That's got to be it.
I like the last question from St. Joseph. Where shall I lead thee and cover thy disgrace? I mean, he's turning to her for her wisdom. Okay, she's the seat of wisdom.
Isn't that amazing? He's not making all the decisions.
Yeah.
Where should I take you? You know, I'm going to take you someplace. I'm going to take care of you, and I'm going to make sure that no one sees you. For a Jewish woman to give birth, there would be no males present. There'd be a midwife, right? It wasn't considered correct to have a male in a birth, right? Although, with the exception being way in the earliest days of the patriarch, there's a tradition that Joseph's children were born on the knees of Jacob, and therefore he adopted Manasseh and Ephraim. But that not in Israel of the time of Jesus. So he's going to find privacy for her is what he's going to do. So do we have a reader for section 18?
I'll read.
Thank you, Tim.
And he found a cave there, and led her into it. And leaving his 2 sons beside her, he went out to seek a midwife in the district of Bethlehem. And I, Joseph, was walking, and was not walking. And I looked up into the sky, and saw the sky astonished. And I looked up to the pole of the heavens, and saw it standing, and the birds of the air keeping still. And I looked down upon the earth, and saw a trough lying, and work people reclining, and their hands were in the trough. And those that were eating did not eat, and those that were rising did not carry it up, and those that were conveying anything to their mouths did not convey it, but the faces of all were looking upwards. And I saw the sheep walking, and the sheep stood still. And the shepherd raised his hand to strike them, and his hand remained up. And I looked upon the current of the river, and saw the mouths of the kids resting on the water and not drinking, and all things in a moment were driven from their course.
Thank you, Tim. This is an astounding passage. This Joseph takes her to the cave. He's not there, and he goes out to seek a midwife, right? And all things stand still. This is a bit of poetry. All nature, all creation stands still for the birth of the Lord. That is known to almost nobody, just Joseph, Mary, and I guess these two sons. When in Professor Close's translation, he doesn't leave it in text like this. And he lines it up line by line, and most of the first half all start with and. And it's so beautiful when you see it lined up as poetry. And wouldn't you know, I went to print it for you all today so you could see how extraordinary this poem is, and my printer just wouldn't work with my Macintosh, you know. So hopefully I'll get my grandson to help me out, and you'll have it next week. But it walked. But you see it there? It's an astounding poem. And what else is, before I reread it in the poetry fashion, there's something else very curious here. Look at the first sentence. And he found a cave there and led her into it. Third person. Vicky says there's a switch in persons. Right. When you get to the second sentence, it says, I, Joseph, direct address, first person, by Joseph. Until now, we've had nothing but third-person narrative, right? And we will return to third-person narrative. This tells us something about this composition. It's in poetry and not in prose, even though this rendition doesn't show you that, unfortunately. And I, Joseph, notice the and, was walking, next line, and was not walking. And I looked up into the sky, next line, and saw the sky astonished. And I looked up to the pole of the heavens, and saw it standing, and the birds of the air keeping still. And I looked down upon the earth, and saw a trough lying, and work people reclining, and their hands were in the trough, and which would indicate eating, right? And those that were eating did not eat. And those that were rising did not carry it up. You can imagine the hands coming to eat, right? And those that were conveying anything to their mouths did not convey it. But the faces of all were looking upwards. Did you see the summative line there? Everything has stopped still. They're eating and they're not eating. And now they're all looking up. And I saw the sheep walking, and the sheep stood still. And the shepherd raised his hand to strike them, and his hand remained up. And I looked on the current of the river, and I saw the mouths of the kids resting on the water and not drinking. And all things in a moment were driven from their course. It's just, I hope you can see how exquisite this is.
It's so visual.
Visual,
Yeah.
very visual. And you've got the birds of the air, you've got the sheep on the ground, and you've got the people in their daily round of activities. It's probably late in the day because the people are having their evening meal, right? But he can still see everything. It's not night yet, apparently. And it's as if all creation stood still for the birth of the Lord.
I kind of envision it like a snapshot.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
But you see the contradiction? They were rising, but they stood still. They were drinking, but they didn't drink. It's everything as we know it, the way the world is supposed to turn, stops. Saint Ignatius of Antioch, a really early saint, I think he's born 100 and dies 160. No, that's Polycarp. Ignatius might be a little bit earlier. Really, the generation after the gospel writers says that there are 3 times when God works in the world in secret or in silence. This is one. Now I'm trying to remember the other 2. There's 2 more. The birth of the Lord. The death of the Lord, and there's 1 more. The Immaculate Conception. And not the Immaculate Conception, the Incarnation. The Incarnation, the birth of the Lord, and the death of the Lord, where everything stops. And yet, God is acting enormously, but silently, right? So people at the when Mary conceived, Mary only knew because the angel told her, but a wondrous thing had happened. God had entered his own creation and taken on flesh, right? Then here he's about to emerge, and no one's going to see it except some shepherds. And then when he dies, everybody thinks he's a criminal and they're taunting him. But the curtain of the temple rips from top to bottom. You see, God acts, it makes incredible acts in secret, according to Ignatius of Antioch, in silence. A just extraordinary poem. And Professor Close finds a parallel in a line from the Book of Wisdom, chapter 18. I'm going to try and find it for you. Let me see. Hope I can find this. Oh, I keep missing wisdom. Tobit. Oh, that's Wisdom of Solomon, sorry. Proverbs, Songs, here it is. And it's 18. Has anyone found it ahead of me? See if you can find 18, just verses 14 and 15.
What is it, what section?
It's chapter 18, Book of Wisdom. You think? Songs.
Do you want me to read it?
Yes, please.
For his soul was pleasing to the Lord, therefore he sped him out of the midst of wickedness. But the people saw it and did not understand, nor did they take this into account. I'm sorry, was that the right? No, that's the wrong wisdom.
Okay, Wisdom 18.
I'm sorry. Wisdom 18, huh?
Yeah,
18 what?
verses 14 and 15.
Okay, I've got it now. Shall I try again?
Yeah.
Sorry. For when peaceful stillness compressed everything, and in the night, in its swift course, was half spent, your all-powerful word from heaven's royal throne bounded a fierce warrior into the doomed land.
Did you hear it? In peaceful silence in the night. What was the last line? You're all powerful.
Your all-powerful word from heaven's royal throne bounded a fierce warrior into the doomed land.
Your all powerful word from heaven bounded a fierce warrior into the land. That's Jesus, right? You see this incredible intertextuality that we have in God's word?
In the New Revised Standard Version, it reads, "For while gentle silence enveloped all things, and night in its swift course was now half gone, your all-powerful world leapt from heaven, from the royal throne, into the midst of the land that was doomed."
Wow, wonderful translation there. Did you read it again, Rick? Loud.
"For while gentle silence enveloped all things, and night in its swift course was now half gone, your all-powerful world leapt from heaven, from the royal throne, into the midst of the land that was doomed."
Isn't it beautiful? The word in the beginning was the word, and the word came down. Right. Okay, so that chapter 18 is really a poem, and it has this switch to the first person, and that will continue for just a little ways. I'll read the beginning of 19. "And I saw a woman coming down from the hill country, and she said to me, 'O man, whither art thou going?' And I said, 'I am seeking a Hebrew midwife.' And she answered and said unto me, 'Art thou of Israel?' And I said to her, 'Yes.' And she said, 'And who is it that is bringing forth in the cave?' And I said, and so forth. It goes on. And ultimately, in the middle here, the first person stops. So do we have a reader for 19?
I'll read.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Do you want me to reread what you said?
Yes, please.
And I saw a woman coming down from the hill country, and she said to me, O man, whither art thou going? And I said, I am seeking a Hebrew midwife. And she answered and said unto me, Art thou of Israel? And I said to her, Yes. And she said, And who is it that is bringing forth in the cave? And I said, A woman betrothed to me. And she said to me, Is she not thy wife? And I said to her, It is Mary that was reared in the temple of the Lord, and I obtained her by lot as my wife. And yet she is not my wife, but is conceived of the Holy Spirit. And the midwife said to him, Is this true? And Joseph said to her, Come and see. And the midwife went away with him, and they stood in the place of the cave, and behold, a luminous cloud overshadowed the cave. And the midwife said, My soul has been magnified this day, because mine eyes have seen strange things, because salvation has been brought forth to Israel. And immediately the cloud disappeared out of the cave, and a great light shone in the cave, so that the eyes could not bear it. And in a little that light gradually decreased, until the infant appeared, and went and took the breast from his mother Mary. And the midwife cried out and said, This is a great day to me, because I have seen this strange sight. And the midwife went forth out of the cave, and Salome met her, and she said to her, Salome, Salome, I have a strange sight to relate to thee. A virgin has brought forth a thing which her nature admits not of. Then said Salome, As the Lord my God liveth, unless I thrust in my finger and search the parts, I will not believe that a virgin has brought forth.
Great, thank you, Stephanie. Isn't this incredible? This is so much of an expansion on anything we've heard about the birth of the Lord. So the first person ends where he says, I obtained her by lot as my wife, and yet she's not my wife. You see it? But has conceived of the Holy Spirit. First time we mention the Holy Spirit here, even though Luke and Matthew start with the Holy Spirit. When she says, How can this be? I know not man. And the angel tells her the Holy Spirit will come upon you. It will overshadow you. And then it says, and that's where the first person ends. And the midwife said to him, Is this true? To him, not to me. You see it? Right in the middle. So it seems like, in my opinion, an interpolation of that incredible poetry of the moment that Christ was born, and Joseph's experience of all the world standing still, the world as he knew it, couldn't remain the same at the moment that the Creator, God, entered his own creation. He couldn't. He couldn't stay the same. So, wow, look what happens here. What else is new in here or curious that you want to talk about?
It's like the cloud, like the transfiguration.
Absolutely, this is very much like the Transfiguration. Yes. And what else does the cloud represent?
In the Old
Holy
Testament, it was the presence of God.
It was the presence of God, the Shekinah, the shining cloud, right? And so that cloud is there at the moment that Mary gives birth, which also gives her the privacy that he was talking about, right? What else?
But then it becomes so bright that no one can see anything.
Right, then as the cloud dissipates, that's the presence of God, Old Testament image of the presence of God. We get a bright, bright light that no one can stand, and that's Jesus, right? And as the light lessens, you can see the child who, as it disappeared, the great light, so that eyes could bear it, and in a little, that light gradually decreased until the infant appeared and went and took the breast from his mother. There's an immediate move from the delivery, the vaginal delivery, to the breast, which is amazing, which would have satisfied Jewish Christians, because God could not be born in anything impure, and according to the old purity laws, menstrual blood, any bodily secretion, certainly the blood from a delivery, would make her impure. So this seems to suggest that this miraculous birth was such that either there was no blood or possibly there was none. But it would have upset the Jewish Christians. In the earliest days of Christianity, one of the greatest tensions was that we had two types of Christians, converted Jews and converted Gentiles. And the Gentiles didn't want circumcision. They didn't want these purity rules. And the earliest Christians who had been Jews, there was a great discussion between Paul and Peter, and guess who wins? In Acts of the Apostles, Paul wins. We don't need to observe all of this, just three things that they had. So this would, since this is an early document, this would cover that. And that, so that as soon as we can see the child, he takes the breast of his mother. What else?
It just makes you kind of wonder that, I mean, so the midwife was helping to deliver the baby with all this bright light. I mean, it just makes me think like I'm...
It's almost like she got there after the birth.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
She has no role.
Yeah.
She appears to have no role. Joseph brings her. It doesn't sound like Joseph's there, but he does bring her, and that would have been very Jewish. She is a Jewish girl who's completely righteous and follows all law. So this is the midwife comes in. But then this is a miraculous birth. And she does serve a purpose, though. What does she say?
She's a witness.
Well,
She's the witness?
and she understands, I mean, she understands, she says, my soul has been magnified,
Right.
salvation has been brought forth.
This is a great day
Somehow
to...
she understands.
She understands and she doesn't understand. This is a great day to me because I have seen this strange sight. And she immediately goes out of the cave, and Salome met her. Now, we've never heard of this Salome. She gets no introduction. We assume she's another midwife, right? And her name is interesting. We know about Salome later on in the gospel. She's the daughter of Herodias, who marries Herod Antipas. And that terrible scene where she asked for the head of John the Baptist. So the name Salome comes from the Hebrew word shalom. It means peaceful one, right? So Salome, and so she tells it immediately. She gets to announce the birth of the Lord. This Jewish midwife to Salome, I have a strange sight to relate to you. A virgin has brought forth a thing which her nature admits not of. But she knows it. And she believes it, right? But Salome doesn't.
She's like Thomas.
Yes.
Just like Thomas. Unless I thrust in my finger and search the parts, I will not believe that a virgin has brought forth.
Just like Thomas.
Direct parallel by this author to doubting Thomas, right? Direct parallel. I don't know about you, but I feel sorry for Mary. I do not want people reading
Right.
about a pelvic exam
Right.
in my nativity scene. So historically, Professor Close says there was reaction against this section. They wanted it, some people wanted it excised, that it shouldn't happen to our Blessed Mother.
Marianne,
Yes.
I was just curious, why the older Jews, the old people, would consider something that is so natural as bleeding from menstrual period, bleeding from the birth, an amniotic fluid. If that is so natural and pure, why would it be considered impure when it's so natural and universal
Yes.
to propagate people?
Yes. I don't know the root question you're asking is why is blood in the Old Testament considered impure?
Yeah.
It says in, I believe it's Genesis, that in the life principle, what made each human alive was contained in the blood, right? So number one, it's part of a larger doctrine that therefore you could never shed blood, with one exception, unless it was an animal that was being offered to God, and it could only be done by the priest who was ordained and anointed, right, by Moses and then a direct descendant, hereditary lineage of priests. And only they could. And when they did shed the blood of an animal, right, blood was collected in basins because it was considered holy, and it was sprinkled around the altar and even the Holy of Holies. So blood, but any other blood, and then that was collected and burned, I think. There's a long history to this in Exodus and Leviticus that describe it. Any other shedding of blood was totally unlawful. But just going back to your statement, birth is a natural process instituted by God. I think the development of the purity laws is a separate entity to what later on Jesus will say. But at that point, they were so concerned that God had said he would dwell with his people and the land belonged to him at the end of the book of Numbers, and that if the land could be quote unquote polluted by unholy sacrifice, improper use of incense, all sorts of body secretions, and they feared the loss of God's presence, right? So they were very careful about all things containing blood, and perhaps by extension, they made that include perfectly natural bodily functions. For example, the woman, after the birth of her child, was, if she delivered a male child on the 33rd day, was supposed to come to the temple and be for purification. And we used to have the Feast of the Purification of Mary, which would then admit her, after certain ritual bathing, back into the presence of God in the temple. And if it was a female child, on the 66th day after purification. A man going into battle was considered holy if God answered the question of a priest or a prophet before the Ark of the Covenant, shall we go up against the Ammonites? And God answers yes through the use of holy stones. Then warfare became holy because God's presence was fighting for you. You didn't really win the war. And since God was with you in the war, guess what? Soldiers could not have sexual intercourse with their wives for a period of time before they went to war. All again, but the whole idea that God's presence was somehow biological, physical, and a ritual impurity made him leave, such as oil and water don't mix. Are you still with me? But it still doesn't get to the root problem of, all right, we understand how shedding of blood of animals that was not sacrificed to God was unlawful because the life principle created by God was in that blood and you were just letting it go on the ground.
Okay, I can see that a
Right.
little bit, yeah.
Right. And definitely the sacrifice of children, which went on in ancient Israel and other countries around there, was terribly the most impure thing. But it doesn't get to the root problem of the God-created nature too. And Jesus takes these purity laws and says nothing is impure that comes that you put into your body. Speaking of food, now he doesn't get into other bodily functions, only what comes out of your heart. But he does take the purity laws and flip them, right? But I don't think I can never fully answer that question. It's one of the great mysteries. Why blood? Why bodily fluids?
Sounds like Jesus came just in time to save them
Yes.
from illogic.
Yes. Well, another way to put it is God's revelation. If I had a long blackboard, and I used to do this, and not only would I do the Bible timeline, but under it I would draw a line about the progression of divine revelation through Scripture. You know, there's so much, God only, we creep before we walk, and St. Paul says this in Romans. And so God's revelation, they needed the law like a playpen to hold them in. But through the law, St. Paul says, they also learned about sin, and then through original sin, they wanted to break the law, right? The inclination of man to do the opposite, like a child wants to have the cookie if he knows it's in the cookie jar. And so that so divine revelation is progressive. That all the way up to Jesus, for the most part, the Jews had no idea of life after death, right? They thought they wanted God's justice here and now on earth, because after that you just went to the pit, to Sheol. And in Jesus, we learn about the resurrection of the body, although some Pharisees ahead of Jesus, we don't know how much ahead of Jesus this went on, did already believe in the resurrection of the body. And we know that there's life after death and there's a judgment after death. That's all part of that incredible progression of divine revelation. And we say that divine revelation is complete and full in the gospel, in the revelation of Jesus Christ. So looking back to your question, if they knew the fullness of God's truth, they wouldn't have needed the Messiah to come. And you see? And bring it all up to date. I'm watching the time. Okay, we're good. There's doubting, we have doubting Salome. There's something else here that's very important for the earliest audience for this document. We don't have one midwife, we have two midwives. Why?
Two witnesses.
Two witnesses. The book of Numbers requires that no one can be judged on the basis of one witness. There have to be two, right? Okay. And there they are. We've got the witness of two individuals. One named midwife and one unnamed midwife. Okay, and now I want to tell you something very curious. Section 20. There are two main commentaries that I've consulted. One by a Frenchman who wrote it a long time ago in 1910, named Amand. Émile Amand. He wrote it in French. And then when Professor Klaus wrote this one only recently, I think it's 2016, he's writing it against some of the things that when Professor Anand marginalizes this document for a lot of reasons. And he reinterprets it so that it's not marginalized. And one of the things that he says is he believes that originally, and with very good verification, that Section 20 was the original end of the story, and except for the very end of 24, which is really the author's signature, and I, James, that wrote this history in Jerusalem, and so forth. He says that's original, but 21 up until that last paragraph, he thinks is an addition, and you'll see why as we come to it. He believes this is 20 is the end of the original story, and the earliest document that we have, which is in the Bodmer Museum, was discovered in Egypt and brought to Bodmer. I think it's in Switzerland, but I'm not sure. It doesn't have these extra passages. That's a pretty good witness if you have a parchment like that. So go ahead. Who will read 20 first?
I'll read.
Thank you, Shayla.
And the midwife went in and said to Mary, "Show thyself, for no small controversy has arisen about thee." And Salome put in her finger and cried out and said, "Woe is me for mine iniquity and mine unbelief, because I have tempted the living God. And behold, my hand is dropping off as if burned with fire." And she bent her knees before the Lord, saying, "O God of my fathers, remember that I am the seed of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Do not make a show of me to the sons of Israel, but restore me to the poor. For thou knowest, O Lord, that in thy name I have performed my services, and that I have received my reward at thy hand." And behold, an angel of the Lord stood by her, saying to her, "Salome, Salome, the Lord hath heard thee. Put thy hand to the infant, and carry it, and thou wilt have safety and joy." And Salome went and carried it, saying, "I will worship him, because a great king has been born to Israel." And behold, Salome was immediately cured, and she went forth out of the cave justified. And behold, a voice saying, "Salome, Salome, tell not the strange things thou hast seen, until the child has come into Jerusalem."
Thank you. So the parallel to doubting Thomas continues, right? Doubting Thomas puts his hand into my side. She says to Mary, "Show thyself." Another translation is "arrange thyself." or settle thyself. And she examines Mary, and then she cries out, woe is me. Thomas says, my Lord and my God. She says pretty much the same thing when she says, a great king has been born to Israel. She acknowledges him as Messiah, right? But there's another biblical reference that comes to mind when you hear her, and her hand is dropping off as if it were burned with fire, and then she touches the infant Jesus and she's healed. So we have the first healing of Jesus. She gets to announce the birth to the midwife by a virgin. The virgin birth is announced, and she's the first healing of the infant Jesus, which is amazing. But does this remind you of anything in the Old Testament?
Yes, it reminds me of when they used to carry around
The ark?
the ark, and that, you couldn't
Yes.
get near it.
If you carry it right. Although you could also perish. If you were not a
Right,
priest,
that's
you
right.
got too close to the ark, you could also perish.
Exactly, and so.
God's holiness was consumed with fire, right?
That's kind of what it reminded me of.
Right. Yes,
She
only
got too close.
she-
And here's Mary, that, is, Mother of God, and, and
yes,
she's-
right. Is there another passage? Do you remember where in the wilderness wanderings, I think this is in Numbers, there are several rebellions, but there's Korah's rebellion. There's also the rebellion of Miriam and Aaron, the brother and sister of Moses, against Moses' authority. And they say, we're all holy, you're not the only one that's holy. And Moses, in great humility, tells them to present themselves before the ark, the tent of meeting. They couldn't go into the Holy of Holies. And Moses prays. And what happens is Miriam's hand becomes, the cloud comes down. When the cloud lifts, her hand is leprous. Do you remember the story? And Moses prays for his sister that God would deliver her from this disease, and God answers his prayer, and she is healed. And they both do obeisance to Moses as the chosen leader of Israel. And this is so similar. They rebelled. This one doubted, and now something happens to her hand. So this writer is taking parallels. He's borrowing widely from the Old Testament. And carried it saying, I will worship him because a great king has been born to Israel. So we get her prayer of faith. And she goes forth from the cave justified. That rings a bell too in the New Testament. Who is it that meets Jesus, is healed, and comes out just... Oh no, it's this parable of the publican, the Pharisee and the publican. And the one who beat his breast, and he sat in the back of the temple and said, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. And the Pharisee goes up and says, I don't do this, I'm not like these other people.
Right.
And it's the humble one that goes out justified. And she is justified too. What about that last line? And behold, a voice saying, Salome, Salome, tell not the strange things thou hast seen until the child has come into Jerusalem. There's a parallel there too.
Isn't that like Jesus telling, do not tell anybody
Mhm.
what
Yes.
you've seen?
He says it several times, but a clear one is the transfiguration. We've been following along here because we've had that theophany in the cave with the cloud and the light, right? And Jesus tells James and John in Matthew 17, tell no one. And I don't remember, does anyone remember? It's Matthew 17:9. Do we have time? Yeah, we do. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." Tell no one. So they were given an extraordinary vision of the glory of God before he had ever even died or risen from the dead. Jesus in his glory. And tell no one until the child has come into Jerusalem. When is the child going to come into Jerusalem?
On Sunday.
That's one of them.
And
Yeah.
then followed by the Passion and the Resurrection.
Is the temple that where Simeon is that it?
The presentation in the temple happens earlier, but both would work. The whole idea of one echoing another. I would vote for the idea that this writer is suggesting that he's about to go up to Jerusalem because you had, on the 33rd day, you had to present the child and his mother in the temple for the purification of the mother. And so that's what it sounds like. Don't tell anyone until... The temple is an important figure here. If Jesus is God, as we all believe, and as this document clearly shows, he needs to... The temple is the, for Jews, was the locus of the presence of God. So Jesus, humbly delivered in a cave, in short order will be brought into his own temple, into the presence of God, because he is God. God will enter his temple on the, not on the literal level, but on the allegorical, well, it's literal and allegorical and tropological, all the levels of biblical interpretation. And at the presentation, God enters his temple. The Son of God enters his temple.
See, I'm thinking here, though, that the Jews at the time were expecting a Messiah. And we know in this story that later on, the Magi, they come, okay, and tell Herod, and, and then Herod, gives out the order to slay all the children born. So, I mean, and here I could see, the Holy Spirit, telling Salome not to say anything until the child has come to Jerusalem, because, people are expecting a Messiah, and that might put the child in jeopardy.
Mm-hmm. I think that works too, right? And the very next section, which Professor Kloss argues is an addition based on earliest manuscript, will tell about the threat to Jesus and the slaughter of the innocents in the flight into Egypt. So yes, that works too. Tell not the strange things thou hast seen. What's missing from this scene? That's in Matthew.
Shepherds.
The shepherds are not there. We have two midwives instead. Isn't it extraordinary? But they function as witnesses to what? This writer cares about something greatly.
The virginity.
The virginity, one of the four Marian dogmas, and also her ritual purity. No issue of blood with the birth. It's extraordinary. So he wants to, and he's how else could you, for early Jewish converts, convince them that there was a virgin birth, but two midwives examining Mary? See it? That is the concern of this writer. And I will repeat for everybody what I said a couple of times ago. Since this is not canonical in the Gospels, it's not in the Bible, New Testament, we don't have to believe all of this. Although I think traditionally it has been incredibly edifying for people to read this. Especially that poem of the world standing still at the birth of Jesus. An amazing poem. And the emphasis on, and it, as a historical document, it proves that in earliest Christianity, there was the belief in the virgin birth, right? So we have, about 6 minutes, so we can get through section 21. Do we have a reader for 21?
I'll read Mary.
Thank you, Vicki.
And behold, Joseph was ready to go into Judea. And there was a great commotion in Bethlehem of Judea, for Magi came, saying, Where is he that is born King of the Jews? for we have seen a star in the east and have come to worship him. And when Herod heard, he was much disturbed and sent officers to the Magi. And he sent for the priests and examined them, saying, How is it written about the Christ? Where is he to be born? And they said, In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written. And he sent them away. And he examined the Magi, saying to them, What sign have you seen in reference to the king that has been born? And the Magi said, We have seen a star of great size shining among those stars and obscuring their light, so that the stars did not appear. And we thus knew that a king had been born to Israel, and we have come to worship him. And Herod said, Go and seek him, and if you find him, let me know, in order that I also may go and worship him. And the Magi went out. And behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them until they came to the cave, and it stood over the top of the cave. And the Magi saw the infant with his mother Mary, and they brought forth from their bag gold and frankincense and myrrh. And having been warned by the angel not to go into Judea, they went into their own country by another road.
So this section, how would you characterize this?
Right out of Matthew.
Straight out of Matthew. Oh my goodness, yes. It's almost word for word. Do you notice anything curious in the first line there? Behold, Joseph was ready to go into Judea.
Is Bethlehem in Judea?
Bethlehem, Carol rightly says, isn't Bethlehem in Judea? Absolutely. This is one of Professor Close's arguments, besides the parchment argument, that this is of another hand. The other writer knows his geography. This is a geographical error, right? Bethlehem, if you go there today, is a suburb of Jerusalem, right? And you go through a gate, and because it's on the other side of the wall that separates the West Bank. So he seems to really mean, behold, Joseph was ready to go to Jerusalem, but he uses Judea. Now, Jerusalem also is in Judea, but so is Bethlehem. So that's one clue that this may be from another hand, another author. And word for word. And they said in Herod asks, how is it written about the Christ? Where is he to be born? And they said, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written. And that's, you know where it's written? Where is it written? That from Bethlehem would come the Messiah, the King. Not Isaiah. It's in Micah, chapter 5:2, and I have it in front of me. But you, O Bethlehem of Ephrathah, who are one of the little clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to rule in Israel, whose origin is from of old, from ancient days. Therefore he shall give them up until the time when she who is in labor has brought forth. Then the rest of his kindred shall return to the people of Israel, and he shall stand and feed his flock, the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they shall live secure, for now he shall be great to the ends of the earth, and he shall be the one of peace. Beautiful prophecy of the Messiah, as who will be born in Bethlehem. And Bethlehem was the tribal city of whom? David, right. And the Messiah is going to be the son of David in the direct line of David, the greatest king that they had. So there it is. So not too much else is different in there. So we'll stop there at 20. It's near 11 at 22. And for next time, it'll be very easy reading. We will finish reading just 22 through 24, right? And we'll wrap up the Protoevangelium with a few details about how it's used historically and so forth. And what I do want to put an emphasis on what was the real concern of this author to write this down? What was his focus on Mary? There are more than one perspective that you could take on Mary to describe her childhood, her birth, her parents, her betrothal to Joseph, and the birth of Christ. We're into the third section, the last section, the birth of Christ.
Thank you.
Thank